Hi, and welcome to another episode of Climate Economics with me, your host, Arvid Fiana. And today I have the pleasure of talking to Professor Lorenzo Trimarchi, an economist who is doing exciting research at the intersection of trade and the environment. And he recently published a paper in the Journal of Development Economics on the US China trade war of 2018 called The Unintended Consequences of Trade Protection on the Environment. And he shows that a trade war can lead to negative consequences for the environment, which we'll discuss extensively in this episode. And I think there's a lot to be learned from that paper, given that the current US administration has been quite active in not only threatening to raise tariffs, but also executing on that threat. So my guest is Lorenzo Trimarchi, who is an associate professor of economics at the University de Namur in Belgium. He holds a PhD in economics from the European Center for Advanced Research in Economics and Statistics of the Université Libre de Bruxelles. So in some ways, this is a hometown game because he's in Belgium. So this is where also I am based, but it's online. And his research interests are international trade, political economy, banking, and corporate finance. So Lorenzo, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much, Arvin. Thank you for inviting me. It sounds a fantastic project. I'm very happy to participate.
Thank you very much. And as I said in the introduction, I'm very excited to talk to you because I think there's a lot to be learned from your paper. And so I was thinking, to start off, could you just give us a general overview of your paper and what you were trying to do?
Thank you, Arvid, for the invitation again. And this is a project that we started years ago, joined with Rui Xie and Taipeng Li from Hunan University and Guo Yang, which is now assistant professor of economics at Liaoning University in China. And at the time was when he started the project, was postdoctoral researcher at the Université de Namur. And this is a project in which we try at the intersection between international trade and environmental economics. And in this project, we try to understand what is the impact of the trade war on environmental regulation in China. But I want to tell you a bit about the story of the project so you understand how the project was born and what was the reasoning behind our research plan. So the project started in January 2021, and Guo started to work on a simpler research line with the Taipeng and Rui, in which they were just say, okay, there is this general literature on the impact of trade policy on the environment. There is the famous paper of Grossman and Kruger about the costs of naphtha for the environment. So starting from this very standard international trade and environment question, Guo, Taipeng, and Rui, they were running regression investigating the impact of the trade war on pollution. And this preliminary evidence, surprising, was pointing at the trade war triggering an increase in pollution in China. What is surprising, because as a trade economist, we tend to think about tariff as mainly as a negative income shock, especially for developing countries. So we expect, okay, China is a country heavily specialized in manufacturing. If we give a large trade shock, we expect China to reduce income and therefore to decrease pollution. And that's the prior my co-authors had at the beginning. And this was also supporting from some preliminary evidence on the economic side by Binjing Li and Devin Shore, that they showing their GIE paper that the trade war was a negative economic shock for China. So for us, this was absolutely puzzling, and we were trying to come up with different explanations why this was possible, investigating all the three channels under which trade economists think about the relationship between trade and the environment. That is the scale effect. So the impact, this income effect that we say the tariff should have a negative impact on pollution because we decrease the scale of production. Take the composition effect. Maybe China, because tariffs are somehow disproportionately accounting for polluting the polluted products. Now China changed the product span and they produce more polluting products. And the third is the famous technique effect. And this includes also environmental regulation. And by discussion with my co-authors, we started to think this may be the channel, also because the general discussion around the world If you remember at the time, we are speaking about 2021, we are in the aftermath of COVID, after we had the Russian aggression to Ukraine, and we observed several reversal of historical environmental policy around the world, including, if you think to Germany, we had this big case of a socialist and the Green coalition that decided to open again coal plants in Germany, and we started to think to this idea. Maybe the government reacted to by changing regulation, and together with my co-author, and I have to give especially credits to my co-author for this massive data collection on environmental regulation in China. We started to investigate if the trade war had any effect on environmental regulation, and the answer is yes. This is the most robust part of our paper. So environmental regulation seems to be affected by the trade war in a way that the trade war induced an easing in environmental regulation for China. So this is the first big results. The negative shock in trade policy seems to have a negative effect on environmental regulation.
So the first one is because there's tariffs, then the regulators make it easier for companies to comply, or they lower the standards, and that leads to the increase in pollution.
Exactly. That's what we measure, because indeed that's the way we measure the change in environmental regulation. With my co-authors, we collected three main measures. The first, if you want, is a more of a political objective related measure. Is by using machine learning technique, we went through all the prefecture. Our analysis is at prefecture level. We went through all the prefecture annual reports. So those are official documents by the local Chinese Communist Party, in which the Chinese Communist Party explain their policy objective for the next year. So those are very important. And we will discuss later about the Chinese political economy. But for the way the Chinese political economy works, those are important documents because
Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah.
so those are and this is the first source. So we try to come up with an index of environment stringency of environmental policy. Of course, those are words, so we needed to collect complementary information. And the first one, and this is a unique data set. The second one we collected using something similar to the FOIA request, the Freedom of Information Act request there is in the United States. There is again, it's something surprising, at least for me, but you have a similar type of mechanism in China, in which Chinese citizen can ask to the government, please, for research purpose, tell us what has been the policy in this area. And fortunately enough, many prefectures answered to us.
I was surprised by that, and for those listeners in Europe, the Freedom of Information Act is something in the US where you can ask for information from the government and they have to give it to you. So it's interesting that there's something similar.
There is something similar. Then I don't know, because I'm using the Freedom of Information Act for the US myself for another project, and I don't know if the level of compliance is comparable to what we have in Europe, in the United States. But on our side, we were happy to see that there was cooperation by local government authorities, that they were providing us. Clearly, we didn't get the coverage of 100% of the sample, also because there is a manual data collection component, because you need to physically write to all of them, and clearly they need to reply to you.
What was your sample then?
Our sample, it changed by measure to measure. So for our main measure, that is the annual prefecture reports, is a 246 prefecture over 330. No, 246, sorry, 246, I think, is for the PM 2.5 targets. And for the prefecture, I think we have a higher number, I think around 290, because all the prefecture, they are assumed to release these annual reports. For them, you have 290, and we have a period from 2013 to 2021.
So this is a huge data set. And I think that's one of the amazing things is the data set, because it sounds like you've just got most of China, if I can.
Absolutely,
Is that correct?
we can clearly see.
You've just got most of
This is
China.
most of China. I mean, we might miss some more rural prefectures, some prefectures in some mountain area. But if you see, there is a map with which we plot the data in the appendix, and there you can see that fundamentally the region with most of the production are there. So we can fairly say we get at least a representative sample of Chinese population and Chinese production. That's what we care at trade economics, right? That we want to capture where the economy is produced.
Exactly. So I think you said you had three measures. So there's the text, there's the CO2 and PM 2.5 of air pollution.
Yes. And then we have a third one that are the environmental actions. So this is a data set collected by the Beijing Beijing Law School, and this data set covers all sort of penalty actions, all sort of government like intervention, like fines against polluting firms. The third data set must be interpreted with a caveat that if we show that the trade war induces a decline in penalty, you can interpret this as either less enforcement, either more compliance. So since we cannot exclude the second, we use it as let's say robustness check because clearly we have a measurement problem there. But if you take the sum of the evidence, I think they all point in the same direction, and this is quite reassuring, I think.
Got it. So thanks for that. And then we got deeper into the measurement, which I think you and your co-authors should give like full credit for because the collection of data is tremendous. And you said you were going to the first part, and then I interrupted you, and then you were going to continue with this some like second.
Yeah, we saw this on emission, and then we thought about regulation, and then we found indeed this effect on regulation. That's I think the logical sequence of what.
So then maybe I think it'd be useful also for the listeners to understand more how the Chinese prefecture's government works and like what promotion criteria are.
Of course, of course. So one of I think of the cool part of the interesting part of this project, one interesting part of this project is to learn a lot about the Chinese political economy. Indeed, in our political system, in our democratic political system, mayors are appointed by electors. And the way they should establish their policies, it is by having some electoral platform upon which they are voted for, and for China this is not just there, because the mayors or the local party secretary, they are appointed by higher level of their political power in China. So, but I think I mean, I'm not the first to. We are not the first to study the Chinese political economy. There is a huge literature in the political economy, try to understand how bureaucracy and how political power is organized in China. And I think that the Chinese Communist Party was facing a big problem, especially in the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union. The Chinese Communist Party changed a lot compared to the way it was organized in the 70s. So clearly, they observed the collapse of the Soviet Union, and they observed that one of the reasons the Soviet Union collapsed was because there was a lack of incentives through the hierarchy. And then the Chinese Communist Party started to think how we can introduce incentives for performance within the party. And de facto, what is I think is fascinating about the Chinese Communist Party is more organized. Despite they are communist, they are more organized like what we would consider a private corporation than a public administration body in Europe, because fundamentally they have the public officials. They are more like corporate executives with a performance contract, and they all compete in a tournament under which they will be selected for a higher level of power for promotion based on some performance indicator established by the hierarchy. That can be the central hierarchy, can be just a higher political hierarchy and geographical level, but it's really top down. And in the 90s, the priority for the Chinese Communist Party was economic growth, as we know. So the Chinese Communist Party was very focused on growth. Then in the 2000s, I mean, starting already from 2008, we all remember with the Beijing Olympic Games, the pressure that Chinese citizens were made on government to fight pollution. And in the 2010 year, we had this war on pollution declared by the Chinese government, and then environmental standard became more and more important for promotion. So politician cares about career, and they know there are some objective indicators that they will determine their career. And let's say that up to the trade war, both GDP and GDP growth and environmental goals, they were equally important. That's what the previous papers established. And I think what is important in our paper that we say, but now that the Chinese government, for the first time, probably since the 80s, is facing a real economic shock, something changed, and this shifted attention towards economic goals versus uh, environmental goals, and because there is a trade-off between the two, and maybe we want to talk about that later.
So they are facing promotion criteria. I think it's actually a nice way to call it a tournament. Like they're competing with each other for getting a promotion. They've got two goals, which is economic growth and then limiting air pollution. But then tariffs hit, and there's a real economic shock, and it seems that the person deciding the tournament is like, now we're going to put a higher weight again on economic growth. So maybe you can talk about why there's a trade-off between growth and air pollution.
Yes, another thing for me, this paper was super interesting. I learned a lot myself by working with my co-authors. Me, I'm by origin more of a political economy guy, and Guao is a trade and environment person, and Taipeng and Rui are very interested in the environment. So I had to learn a lot by myself as well. And one thing I was convinced is that there is almost no trade-off between environmental regulation and productivity or efficiency. Because this is the general idea. No, if we do green investment, this is good for productivity always. But it's actually not true, because it depends from the nature of the firm. If you don't want to pollute, maybe you should make some investment in technology that allow you to pollute less. And this can be costly for the firm, and especially in a period in which the margin might be less because you are under a trade war. This might be particularly important for a policymaker. You might want to relax environmental regulation, not because you like pollution per se, but because you want to somehow affect the cost function of the firm by decreasing their cost of production, and hopefully be able still to be active on the export markets.
Exactly, and I think that's you even have this great quote in the beginning of your paper by literally a Chinese official saying, now that we have this trade war, we don't think, in order to keep growing at the same pace, we'll probably have to go back on some of our environmental goals, which I think it's a very nice quote that I'm going to put in the transcript in the show notes, because I think it's a very nice quote to illustrate this trade-off, which especially if, because it's not only economic growth, I get the sense it's also like this more general social stability. And if a firm were to shut down, that would also mean the loss of jobs. So it goes further than, or maybe firms don't make as much money. It's also like this social stability type of promotion criteria.
Absolutely. This is again not a completely new idea. I mean, this is a beautiful book by the Nobel Prize of this year, so it's always a good moment to mention Darren Acemoglu and James Robinson. There is a book about dictatorship somehow and democracy and dictatorship, which they speak about the fact that all political system, all political leaders, they want to survive a revolution constraint, what Darren Acemoglu and James Robinson call revolution constraint. And therefore, they care about stability. Eventually, in an autocratic system, this stability concern gets larger, but we can fairly say this is true for all political system. Also in Europe, which one among us would think that the Green Party in Germany is against environmental goals? None of us. But still, under economic pressure, they open again coal plants, and this we can observe in all Europe, also in Belgium. And probably, I'm not following closely, but the Belgian politics, but I perceive the attention towards environmental goal is declining towards the last years. And this is probably due to the fact that family are struggling. Many families are struggling under the current economic condition. This is something we should think more about.
I mean, yeah, even I think in Europe, you see that the trade wars, now that there's extra tariffs, and people get much worried about their jobs, the livelihood, firms shutting down. And then generally, still, environmental regulations are costly. So there's some trade off there that you want to have. So, and then you've done a lot of regression and robustness exercises. And this is, I take them at face value. So, but one thing I also observed is that you mentioned that some politicians, especially younger politicians, might be more willing to make that trade-off of like relaxing environmental regulations to promote some, more competitiveness. Could you speak to that, or like what was going on, or why that might be the case?
Absolutely. This is based on, again, this is based on the political economy of China. And still, even when we think about an autocracy, we have to think about politician as a person that overall they fundamentally they face a trade-off. I want you to have a career concern. I want to be promoted in the hierarchy, but they still care about their constituency. And no, I think environmental economics is a field in economics in which the welfare function is quite easy. We all benefit from clean environment, and I think any politician in the world knows that for his or her own citizen having less pollution is a good thing for their welfare. So also in China, they know. But the idea is that if you are younger, for instance, maybe for you career concern are more important, and you might tempted to disregard more environmental regulation under pressure compared to GDP growth because you hope to be promoted. And the same is for maybe recently appointed mayor. But in reality, what we find as a super robust is the role of patronage, which is also quite important in the Chinese political economy literature. So what we find is when we horse race these three characteristics, what we find to be the most relevant is being within the network of your provincial leader makes you more likely to implement this policy. And we have not shown in the paper, but we also collected the data on the provincial annual report work, and we have seen that somehow there has been this shift also in upper level of hierarchy. And you mentioned the citation of I think it was the director for climate policy. I can't remember which ministry in China, but you will tell later in the podcast. And so this was already at the central level. This change in regulation, we have seen this at the provincial level, and very likely, probably, if you have a connection with the provincial leader, you want to please your province leader because you think it will make more likely that somehow you will enter in the leadership of a province in future. You will appointed to the Politburo, and this type of patronage that in our democratic, do we have this type of measure in our democratic system? This type of linkage in our democratic system? Yes, but they are less important because in our system, what matters are votes, while in China, what matters is being appointed clearly. So this gives different incentives. Probably we can get same results, but we have different incentives. Let's say.
Exactly. So it's the if you have a clear link to the province or like higher up, then you're more likely to make sure you meet the criteria than someone who's like less well connected. Maybe you know their prospect for a career is maybe not as good, so they care maybe a little bit less about meeting all the criteria. And it's like you say, this is one of the things I really learned about the paper is here a mayor of a city really is judged by the electorate directly on the trade-off, but there it's almost you get judged by the people higher up in the hierarchy. So um it is a bit like a company in that sense that there's performance criteria that you get judged on, and then there's a scorecard. um so we've talked initially about that your co-authors and you had a different priors going into the research. Was there also things that you found in the data along the way that surprised you?
There was things. I mean, we had the priors. I think something that surprised me was were the weak effect on the economic performance. So we were thinking, then because okay, there is a literature that says, as I told you, that I discovered, regulation should affect productivity. They changed the regulation, and somehow we hoped to find then this will change economic growth. But in reality, we don't find this large effect on the economic side. We find some effect for prefecture that eased a lot the environmental regulation. Then, whether on the welfare point of view, easing a lot, this shows you, this entire set shows you that still the Chinese Communist Party was facing trade-off, and they were taking account trade-off. So not all prefecture were easing relaxing environmental regulation by a lot. Some did. For these few one, we find some economic gains, but for us, it was surprising to see that the gains were limited. So overall, if easing environmental regulation to counter tariff might seem a good idea, I think what we learn is probably not much. Or maybe the welfare costs are too high in terms of.
Yeah. Yeah. So there was a very observable effect on air pollution and CO2 emissions, but the impact on economic performance wasn't that big. So it's more
Exactly.
the which in some sense would then make you think they score worse than their counterfactual counterpart who didn't relax the environmental regulations.
This is true. This is true. If they could have gone, you mean the economic effect, right? It could have gone worse.
Like if we have the older politician with the younger politician in otherwise two similar provinces, and the younger politician thinks I'm going to promote economic activity, but the result is that he didn't promote economic activity that much, but he now has worse air pollution.
Exactly, indeed. That's what probably he found. But still, because I think of this patronage effect, they were still more likely to be promoted.
Yeah.
So what we find that is interesting is that it was for mayors that easy deregulation were more likely to be promoted after the trade war. And this is quite a striking effect. Maybe it's I didn't thought about that, but systematically, but maybe it's linked with this patronage effect that we found that is most concentrated by connected mayors, our result of regulation. So it seems that maybe, okay, you are in the network of the provincial leader, you follow it, the instruction, and then you get rewarded with the promotion,
Yeah.
regardless of the efficiency of the measures taken in place.
Which brings us to the point that sometimes, because I've been in environmental economics a lot, that sometimes when you need to meet these air pollution standards like PM 2.5, you install something, and then it drives up some costs, but uninstalling it is quite hard. So it's almost, once you've installed it, it's like it doesn't make sense to uninstall it as much, even though you've now lowered the pollution. And if you were to have the choice, you wouldn't do it again. But so maybe that's also. Could you speak a little bit more about the trade war that happened? Because we've been talking a lot about the impact that China had, but because it happened in 2018. Could you just maybe then provide some information to the background of what the trade war was about?
Sure. The trade war, in 2000, we know that now we are living in a period of history in which we are all caring about the trade war because Donald Trump is also targeting European products. And
And other products worldwide. It's
and
not
other
just
products
Europe.
worldwide. So and Europe and the European Union now strike a deal, and this was with the United States. This was involving environmental aspect as well. But the trade war and especially the confrontation between U.S. China has deeper roots. So in 2016, Donald Trump won the election on a platform fundamentally complaining about the WTO and the World Trade Organization and the free trade policy of his predecessors before. And I think at that time, I remember the environment, we were probably not taking seriously so much about these promises, but actually we should have taken President Trump seriously. And in February 2018, Donald Trump launched a full trade war against China. This was unprecedented. Was unprecedented both for the scale. So fundamentally, all manufacturing sectors, to some extent, if you look to the data, all manufacturing sectors were covered from the Trump tariff in 2018, and also was unprecedented for the tools Trump used. So Trump decided, I don't care about World Trade Organization rules. I think there is a national security emergency. We will adopt a new tariff, and this constitutes a good, clearly we can discuss about the Trump policy a lot, but this constitutes an interesting shock for us as trade economists thinking about environmental regulation in China. Why? For several reasons. First, this was unexpected somehow in scale. Yeah, now we all know that this is real. We all know that this happened, but I remember very well the discussion in 2016, and I don't think many people were taking the threat of Trump seriously. Uh, Second, I think what is quite interesting for us is that there is a lot of heterogeneity in Chinese specialization, industry specialization. And this is what is giving us variation by the end of the day. So fundamentally, we use what the economists call Bartik research design. So a research design that takes a national level shock this is the Trump tariff. This affects equally all Chinese regions. But what it changed is the fact that regions are differently exposed to the tariff shock because they have a production specialization that differs from each other. So if I produce relatively more steel and Trump puts tariffs that are higher on steel, now I will be more exposed. If I'm a prefecture that maybe I'm more producing more, I don't know, agricultural products that were not much covered by tariffs, then I'm less concerned about tariff. This type of variation is what is really driving our identification strategy, and that's what we exploited for
Yeah,
our metric analysis.
I think it's a good point. Exactly that. 2016 was a different world. Maybe it wasn't as taken as seriously, whereas today it's much different. Um, what was the size of these tariffs?
Thank you for the excellent question. And indeed, what probably most of people do not know, because we think that now we are experiencing the most massive trade war, that also the first trade war was massive. And when if you look at the period from July 2018 to September 2019, which is the month in which the Trump tariff reached their peak, we find that during the trade war, the US imposed the tariff between 10 and 20 and 25% on around 200 billion worth of Chinese exports, and they affected almost 92% of Chinese exporting industry. And to give you again a sense of the size of the trade war, by September 2019, around 48% of Chinese export to the US were facing an increase in tariff, and this accounted for around 6% of Chinese GDP. So we are speaking about a massive shock to the Chinese economy.
You said it. So the tariffs amounted to 6% of Chinese GDP.
Yes.
That's that's a crazy statistic. That puts it in perspective for sure. Wow.
Yeah, clearly China is. I mean, also Belgium is an open
Yeah, I know, but it's still like to say tariffs and 6% of GDP. Because when you hear like, oh, it's 10 to 25, 92%. So
Yeah, no, those are,
anyway, I am shocked to hear that number. Let me just so it's like 6% of GDP is really a lot in terms of and like I know there's differences, but it's still for a country like China. I might cut this out, but sometimes I'm just bewildered in the moment, and then I just
yeah, yeah,
um,
absolutely. Yeah, no, this is big. This was big. We are talking about a lot of yeah, amounting 6% of Chinese GDP. No, this is big. The Trump tariff for China was a big shock. But I think because as economists we tend to study more the U.S. economy, that is a relatively closed economy. I think so. You have this bias
yeah.
in thinking how much trade is important for.
Yeah.
for many countries because
I still remember at the University of Chicago when I was there, and one of the professors like, that's why we don't have very good like international trade economists in the US, because it doesn't matter to the US.
this
I mean, I like it was, of course it's not true, but he was semi joking. Like especially like in the 70s and the 80s, that most of these, the monetary policy with trade and interest rates, they're all like international economists doing it. So
and it's one reason why in Belgium we care a lot about trade because Belgium is one of the most open economy in the world.
exactly,
On the
exactly.
contrary, we care a lot.
Um, how did this trade war end? Like, were those tariffs kept in place? Were they like diminished at some point? Like, how did it change over time?
For us, this is not the what this is what people underestimate. For that, basically, the trade war never ended. So somehow, I think they were removed in the again the I think they were partially removed by Joe Biden, if I recall correctly, by Joe Biden in the aftermath of the Russian aggression to Ukraine during the inflationary spike. I think they were partially removed, but in reality, this is a broader discussion about the trade war. But in reality, I don't know if I would conclude that the confrontation between U.S. and China is particularly driven by Donald Trump. I think what is different between the Republican and the Democrats is the trust towards multilateral organization, which is crucial also for our discussion on trade.
Yeah, because I still want to pick out one thing of your paper, which is you've also studied the retaliatory tariffs from China to the US. But there you found no impact, I think, on these emissions. Could you speak to that?
Is a good point. I mean, fundamentally, this type of regression are addressing, if you want, an omitted variable problem. Yes, you speak about tariff. There were also retaliatory tariff from China to the US. So maybe you could expect the reverse effect, no? Because there, China puts protection. This is a positive income shock, and then this will change regulation. In reality, we find no effect. For me, it's unsurprising in the sense that if you think what retaliatory tariffs were about, these were mainly soybeans and agricultural products. So this is, I think, the reason. So they were not really targeting polluted industry, while Trump was targeting steel, was targeting washing machine, solar panel producer. Those are energy intensive industry. Uh, under which the Chinese government might think rationally, okay, if I manipulate the environmental policy, I might change the path of growth for firms in these sectors.
Yeah, that makes sense. I actually remember now because it was a big thing in America because the soybeans were, soybean farmers are a big
Yeah, of
lobby
course.
group.
There was a beautiful paper by Timo Fetzer and Carlo Schwartz on the Economic Journal showing on actually how the Chinese government were smart in targeting retaliatory products because they were targeting actually constituency that massively voted for Trump, and usually agricultural districts in the south of the United States are usually Republican area, and not surprisingly, the Chinese were targeting these products.
Yeah, yeah, I was in US at the time, and that definitely caught the attention for sure. So I think the other thing why the size of the tariffs and the way you mentioned it is, I think it helps me understand why there was the effects that you saw in the paper. Because sometimes there's like things and there's like some macroeconomic things that happen in productivity, or growth slows down a bit, or there's some, these things. But this is such a big shock that you would actually expect people to change. Because like to some like more minor macroeconomic shocks, you would not expect the Chinese Politburo to like redesign the promotion criteria, because it would just create a lot of uncertainty, and like people be like, okay, what do I have to aim for now? But in response to like a big shock like that, you would like, then it's more clear that there's some reallocation happening maybe among objectives.
Of course, and maybe some experimentations. They are even experimenting, maybe. I mean, it didn't work for the economy, but they were trying several policy tools. We know that they were implementing massive subsidies. they were using monetary policy. So probably I don't claim that environmental regulation was the only and maybe not the main tool in the end of the Chinese government to tackle. We never had this. We never pretended that our paper to be like that, but was one of the tools, and probably was not so effective. That's what we learn in our paper.
Okay, well, that's actually a positive takeaway, I would say, is that
Absolutely,
this
I
is,
agree. I agree.
this is I didn't quite get to. This is a positive takeaway that they weren't so effective in promoting the
Absolutely. It's something we
so
should learn as a European as well. Now that we are under a trade war, and we think about, there were discussion about the competitive compass in the European Parliament around 1 month ago, in which President von der Leyen and the College of Commissioners decided to give less importance to environmental goal in their competitive compass, in their competitive goals. Then I don't know, even in this setting, I don't know how much this will translate in concrete measure, also because I didn't follow so strictly European legislation. But I think there is something to learn, right? If we stop caring about the environment, it's not that magically the economy will grow. Why? Because I think one of the strongest things we learn in international trade that comparative advantage applies. So probably there are market forces that are so strong that environmental regulation will not be able to change unless you do probably a massive change in environmental regulation. And I don't deny this will have an effect, but you need a massive change in environmental regulation.
yeah. Which maybe brings me to another question. In the conclusion of your paper, you actually mentioned two potential also takeaways, and you mentioned that your results cast doubt on using trade policies to address environmental problems such as the EU carbon border tax. And you also mentioned this Shapiro 2020 paper. Could you maybe speak to that, to what you meant with that comment?
Yeah, sure. No, there are, I think, 2 points to be made. In Brussels, there is a lot of enthusiasm around the carbon border tax because it's a way to say, oh, look, we have our crown jewel for our foreign policies, the access to the single market. So if foreign firms want to access to the single market, they should enforce the same level of environmental regulation as we do. Otherwise, they will pay a tariff. And I think our paper does not disqualify, does not invalidate this European policy, but just want to induce people to think more carefully over the spillover of increasing tariff, because by the end, carbon tax is a tariff in developing countries or countries with weaker environmental institutions, because their reaction might be, but if I need to pay anyhow, I need to pay a tariff. It's a bit our idea is a bit the behavioral story, right? If I know that I need to pay a fine, I will have bad behavior anyhow. If I know that I need to pay a tariff, why not relax environmental regulation today to be able to anyhow to enjoy growth, because anyhow the European will make me pay. So I think that we should more carefully think about the political economy in our partners when we set the trade policy, because what we learned in the Chinese case, that many developing countries at some point, I mean, if we see the Chinese case before the trade war, in the moment in which many developing countries will grow, we will do pressure for a green policy anyhow. So I will look to I will not be so negative about trade as a way to promote growth and to promote a better environmental standard. But I don't say neither that this would be completely useless. I think as economists we should be always careful in drawing policy conclusions. But still, I think our paper deserve double thinking on this issue, and going to the great contribution of Shapiro, which I think is a fantastic paper. I mean, I advise all graduate students to read the paper of Shapiro on QJE, because, and why I enjoyed it so much, because I think the author of this paper took a style aspect we all know in international trade, that input products enjoy lower MFN tariff compared to final good, and then he took from the environmental economics literature the intuition that the input goods are also the more polluted than Shapiro in his paper says, look, but then we are implicitly subsidizing polluted products. And this is fun. I found it fantastic because those were two style aspects they were there, and this is how being a great researcher, because you had the two things known, but then you put them together with great economics, and this is a fantastic paper. But I think in the final part of his QJ, in the conclusion, in his paper, he says, okay, then we should change. We should change trade. We should reform trade policy, and some from that we should increase tariff in polluting products. So this is in substantial, if I understand correctly, the proposal of Shapiro in School JE, and in this paper, in the conclusion, himself says, but there is a political economy that can be problematic, and I think our paper supports a bit this conclusion. We believe, because yes, can be problematic if we start to go in a world in which we increase tariff. Okay, yes, maybe the, let's say, the famous scale effect will be such that it maybe will produce less of these polluted products, but it's not straightforward what will be the effect for regulators, because still there is a demand for polluted products, and they might decide to act again on the cost function and to be competitive.
Yeah. Awesome. That's awesome. Then maybe a final question is, has there been a question that I haven't asked you? Is there something you want to talk about that I haven't asked you about that you're like, this is important, or is there something like that?
I will do a small promotion for my next work in environmental economics. So this is, I think, a great idea. I thought to conclude our interview. So I think this is a project. I always been interested in a question regarding the political economy and the environment, because I think the biggest challenge for us, we can, as I told before, I think all politicians all over the world agrees on the idea that a world that is cleaner is a better world. So I don't think any politician think it's good to pollute, it's good to live in a polluted world. The point is the political economy. So is it what are the incentives for politicians to enforce environmental reform or greener policy? And now I'm happy to share that I'm working on an exciting new project with Alvaro Zuniga Cordero, who is a postdoc at the University de Namur, and Juan Robalino from University of Costa Rica, in which we ask a related question, but in this case for a democracy. So, and what is the research question that we are trying to ask? Does climate change induce voters to vote more for green parties? And why we think is relevant, because we believe there is a trade-off. In a world in which climate change is active, we have more extreme weather event, and in this world, you might expect two things, we believe. One can be, okay, I meet from a severe extreme weather event, I become more sensitive, I will vote more for green parties or for parties that enforce green policies. On the other side, an extreme weather event might be a negative economic shock for me. And as we observe in the recent populistic wave, we might be unhappy. You might be unhappy about the current parties and vote for parties that want to reverse climate policy. We believe Costa Rica is an interesting setting for two reasons. One, first, I learned because my co-authors are from Costa Rica, so they knew already. I learned that Costa Rica is a country with enormous climate variability, indeed, and this will give us this type of geographical variation that we used in our China paper. Now I hope to use in this paper in Costa Rica. And the other part of the Costa Rica project in Costa Rica is interesting, I think, is that Alvaro Zuniga Cordero, that is my co-author in this project, collected in his job market paper a fantastic data set linking electoral data at a very granular level in Costa Rica with employer-employee data. So I know in a constituency the economic pattern, we know in a constituency the economic story of a voter, and somehow we can, at a macro level, see, first of all, how a climate shock affects voters, and second, test a potential mechanism. how the voters were affected by this climate shock. So I hope that we will get soon your results and we can speak together about these results in your podcast.
I would be very excited. I would be very excited. So that sounds like a really cool paper. And again, now Costa Rica on a whole different setting with a very finely tuned microdata. So I'm looking forward to that too already, Lorenzo. So thank you much for taking the time. I really, really appreciate it. And thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you, Arvid, and thank you for inviting me to this great initiative. We know more, you need to know more about climate economics and to know also more about what my colleagues around the world are doing. So I hope you will continue to do this podcast. Thank you very much.
Thank you.